backcountry Colorado, hiking, backpacking.
I did a lot of marathons. I was convinced to do some ultras.
Climbing, and I do filming and photography.
I just like the ultras because I love the community. I just think that everybody is so nice, whether they're the first place finishers or, you know, us that kind of mosey along.
Well, Chris Brinlee Jr., welcome to the show, Dispatch Radio. We're sitting here in the dining room of Kelly McConnell. Kelly, hello.
Hi, Russ.
Thanks
Hi,
for
Chris.
having us. Can you explain where your house sits?
My house sits pretty much right near Chautauqua on 14th and Baseline.
Well, we are right in the center of it all. Chris, we're excited to have you on the show. Want to chat with you a little bit about outdoor adventure. You've got a unique story that caught our eye. Just a quick backstory on you. You were a full-time ad agency, kind of 9-to-5 kind of guy living out in California. Decided one day, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to go adventuring around the world. And here we are how many years later?
About 2.5 years later.
And it's still working out for you?
It's working out better than ever.
Take us to the beginning. Take us to where this all started. You were living in California.
Yeah. So after I graduated college from the Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia, SCAD, I moved out to LA for a creative internship at a small interactive agency there, and I worked there for about 10 months, and then I took a position as a junior art director at a much larger, more full-service ad agency called RPA. And so I was working at RPA for about 2.5 years on a couple different big accounts. And most of the work that I was doing just kind of involved sitting in a cubicle. And occasionally I'd have the opportunity to get out a little bit more, but more or less I was there strapped to a desk. And that was kind of the life that I knew. So while I was sitting there one day, I had this idea, and this idea was to go see the world. And at that point, I was 25 years old. I had never been outside of the United States. I had the opportunity to explore a lot of the different states just on different family vacations and going to school in different places and road trips and whatnot. But I had never been outside of the country, and that was something that I really wanted to experience. And my best friend from school had also kind of ended up in LA, a guy named Ori Spear. And so we both kind of had this idea. We're like, let's go to Japan. Let's like experience the craziness of Tokyo. Let's go ride motorcycles through the mountains. And this was a trip that we both really wanted to do. But unfortunately, Japan is really expensive. Both of us were junior creatives, and neither of us could save up enough money to make the trip. And so we kind of were figuring this out a few months before we had sort of planned on going. And I remember sitting in my cubicle, and it was like one of those high cubicles where the walls are kind of above your eye line if you're sitting down. So when you look up, all you see are white walls and white ceiling tiles. Is a little bit like a small white prison. So I remember sitting in this cubicle and hearing a little voice inside my head, and this voice said, go backpacking, go to Yosemite. And I had never been backpacking before. I didn't really know what it was. I had never been to Yosemite before. I didn't really know what that was, but this little voice inside my head was really strong. And so, of course, the first thing I did was pull up Google Images, and I searched Yosemite. And the first thing that popped up was this insane view that many of you will know as a tunnel view. And I had never seen that before, and I didn't know it existed, much less existed 5 hours away from where I was living in Los Angeles. And so it kind of blew my mind. And so I had, at this point, saved up a little bit of money for this trip to Japan. And instead of putting all of that there, I was just like, you know what? I think I might like this backpacking thing. I'm going to go out and buy some equipment. So I went and bought all my own backpacking equipment. Didn't know what I was doing or what I was getting. Bought a bunch of stuff that ended up not being very relevant after my first trip once I kind of became a little more enlightened. But kind of started planning this trip. And my cousin was going to get married. His fiance was from this town right outside of kind of the Yosemite Valley, and they got married at Tenaya Lodge. And so my plan was to go up for the wedding, and then immediately afterward, my friend and I would go into the park and do this backpacking trip that we had planned. And a week before my cousin's wedding, we got the terrible news that my uncle had passed away from pancreatic cancer. And the wedding went on. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess the backpacking trip will go on too. It's what my uncle would have wanted. And what was kind of interesting there is I spent much of my childhood visiting him in the Central Valley. He was a dairy rancher in this little town called El Nido, just south of Merced, kind of north of Fresno a little bit. And my entire childhood, I remember like being out there and like standing in his front yard, kind of near this ranch, and just looking across and seeing these snowy mountains. And I always wondered what they were, but it never thought to ask. And I never had the chance to go out and see for myself what those snowy mountains were. But that was very much ingrained in my early childhood memories. And so it was almost like with my uncle's passing, I was finally discovering these mountains personally for the first time. And so I kind of like to think of it as like it was his passing gift to me. And so we got into the park and we started this backpacking trip. And it's like the beginning of July, it's 100 degrees outside. I'm carrying 60 pounds of stuff for a summer trip, way too much. And we're just like plodding up this Upper Yosemite Valley Trail, just like 3,500 feet and like 3.2 miles. It was just like backbreaking. We were like, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Well done.
Yeah. And so we were off to a great start. And so we get up there and we get back and we go as far as we can. And we end up getting about 8 miles in that first day, which was much more than we expected, but we just kind of kept powering through. And the next morning we're like, okay, we've got 6 miles to do for our day itinerary from our 6-day trip. And so we like start hiking in the morning, and by 10:30 a.m. we hit that 6 mile mark, which was this lake up in kind of north of the valley. And I'm like, okay, well, it's 10:30 a.m. We can't stop hiking now. So we just kind of keep hiking all day long. And we end up pushing out about 15 and a half miles carrying these 60-pound packs. And we stop on this kind of cliff overlooking this gorge. And across the gorge, I see for the first time in my life a snowy mountain up close. It wasn't close enough to like reach out and touch or to be on, but I could see it in detail. And there was still snow on the slopes in July. And that was just kind of a mind-blowing moment for me. And I remember sitting there on this bluff overlooking these mountains as the sun was setting and just thinking, you know, I really want to be on top of that mountain. And I looked at the map, and it was a mountain called Mount Hoffman. We were at about 9,500 feet elevation. And I pointed at the map, and I was like, you know, I think that's the mountain we're looking at right there. And I told my buddy Ori, I was like, I want to climb that. I want to like climb mountains like that. He's like, dude, that's crazy. You have to have like oxygen to climb mountains and stuff. That's like insane. I was like, look, man, it's like not that much higher than we are. I think that is something that could really be doable. He's like, dude, that's crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. So that was kind of like the end of that conversation. We finished up the backpacking trip the very next day and went back to LA. But as soon as we got back, I just had this itch and this hunger and this thirst. And I knew from that moment on, I didn't want to just see mountains. I wanted to be on mountains. And kind of around the same time, I had been like shooting a bunch of lifestyle photography and portraiture, and had done a few commercial assignments in LA, and was like kind of getting a little bit bored with that. And I carried my camera on this backpacking trip, and it was kind of hearkening back to the more documentary shooting roots that I had had from earlier in my photo career. And it was just like these dynamic conditions, and it was ever changing, and it was challenging. And I just loved every aspect of what I was creating from that. And I went on a few more backpacking trips, and I'd leave and do local trips every weekend from LA, just trying to immerse myself in it. And before long, people kind of started to take notice. And it was that winter in December that I had the opportunity to go down to Costa Rica, which was my first trip abroad. And I documented this 10-day guided adventure with a locally owned adventure tour company. And I shot photos and videos of this trip and got to experience a new culture for the first time outside of the border of the US. And it was just this pretty radical experience for me, getting to go and see how other people live and getting to kind of like document this adventure aspect all the while. And I got back to the States, did another little backpacking trip in Yosemite, snow camping with my brother. And that was kind of like on New Year's Eve, we like stood atop the diving board at Glacier Point, which everybody knows from Instagram now. But for us, hiking up there in the winter, it was like this 19-mile round trip hike. We had to start at like 3 a.m. It was freezing cold, and we were like totally miserable. And we were up there, and it was all alone, and we were like just standing on this precipice of death. And it was just the most exhilarating moment of my entire life. And we got back to LA that night, and I went back to work the next day, and I sat down in that cubicle after nearly a month straight of adventure. And I just said to myself, what the fuck am I doing here? And that was the moment when I knew that something had to change. And so I kind of came up with this idea that I would quit my job and travel the world. And it sort of was rooted with, okay, I want to go climb in the Alps. I want to go explore Iceland. And I kind of wanted to do these two things, but I realized with my meager 2-week paid vacation, that wouldn't really be feasible. And I was like, well, maybe they'll let me take an extended leave of absence. And so I started thinking about how I could pull that off. But I lived in LA, and I lived in kind of this big loft that doubled as a photo studio. And my rent was pretty expensive. And so I couldn't really take off for that long. And so I was like, okay, well, what would allow me to take off for long? And I was like, well, if I didn't have to pay rent, I could be gone as long as I could. And I figured without rent, my overhead would be much lower. And then I would be able to afford to take and stretch my 2 weeks paid vacation into 2 months paid vacation. And so that was kind of the idea that started. And I knew that I wanted to leverage this trip as kind of a diving board into this career as an outdoor adventure storyteller. And so that's kind of where it all began, was with that thought, how can I take and stretch these 2 weeks out into be something more?
So you kind of came at it a little opposite than maybe most in this industry, where like somebody maybe starts as an athlete and then they kind of learn how to do the social media and the design and the photography and the writing. You kind of had those skills already, and you were starting to learn the outdoors.
Absolutely.
Has that given you, well, let's move us forward just a little bit. I mean, how have you afforded to live? I guess that'd be the first question people want to know.
So at that point, kind of part of my strategy was I knew that I wasn't going to be making any money for a good while. And so I started cutting my overhead back any way that I could. I stopped going out to eat and started just like cooking really simple meals at home. I cut the cords. I got rid of Xbox Live and cut off
Xbox Live got trashed.
Just about everything except for my Spotify
That's a suffer
Premium.
fest.
Exactly. So you guys know what this is all about. And it kind of got to this point. I was like selling off my things and just doing whatever I could to kind of maximize the cushion that would allow me to go out and create as much content as possible to prove not just to myself that I could do this, but to the world.
Did you buy a van?
I did not buy a van. Most of my kind of initial adventure was all abroad. And part of the way that I was able to stretch out the money that I had saved up was by traveling a lot in kind of less expensive countries where the dollar was stronger. Nepal, Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time over there. And it just kind of allowed me the opportunity to pump out tons of content that I wasn't getting paid for, but I was getting recognized and noticed for, while living very simply and very cheaply. And I just got really good at cutting corners and being incredibly frugal in already inexpensive places. And so that was kind of crucial.
And so, Kelly, one thing we should do, we're a podcast, I think we should paint a picture of our guests sometime. So would you mind taking a stab at that? What are we looking at here?
Well, Chris looks like a mountain man, but I think
with a cool haircut. He's got the cool
he's
haircut.
pretty put together right now.
He's got the beard.
Looking like a little bit more hipster than I expected.
Yep.
I thought, well, because I've been looking at his pictures online of him in the outdoors and his beard
with an ice axe, slinging an ice axe, and
exactly.
tools and
so
whatnot.
His beard and hair isn't as well kept in his photographs, so he's looking very handsome right now.
And he's got some blue jeans and a cotopaxi hoodie sweatshirt, which is important. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So kind of when I had started on this journey, I didn't really know where it was going to lead, but I knew what I wanted out of it. And I got to this point, I was on my second trip back to Nepal. I hadn't made any money for about a year, and I was broke as shit. And it got to the point where I was like, all right, something's going to have to give. I'm either going to have to go back to the office, back to the ad agency, and just beg for mercy to have some agency take me back, or I'm going to have to figure out some kind of way that is sustainable to create branded content with a partner that would be essentially on retainer, to where I could have the consistency of a paycheck. Because let's be honest, we've all got bills. I've got big student loans from going to SCAD. I've got this overhead that no matter what I do, it's always kind of going to be there, at least for this early stage in my adult life. It got to this point, and I knew that something was going to have to give. And I got back from this trip to Nepal, and I got a call from the guys at Cotopaxi, and they wanted to bring me on as kind of their first ambassador athlete, sort of on retainer. And so we kind of discussed what that relationship could look like and figured out what each of us sort of wanted out of it in order to kind of grow ourselves in the relationship. And that's kind of what was, in a lot of ways, my saving grace and my opportunity to continue doing what I'm doing and to keep pushing in the ways that I've been pushing.
How did they know about you?
It was really interesting. Back when I was still sitting in the cubicle, I had been like going out and just doing weekend adventures every single weekend, just like sleeping under the stars whenever I could. And I would just like post pictures on social media on my Instagram. And I remember getting a message. It wasn't even a message. I think this was before Instagram had messaging, but I got a comment on one of my things from this guy named Anders. And Anders was kind of like this college student intern who was working at this company called Cotopaxi, but I didn't know what Cotopaxi was because they didn't really have any products or even a website. It was just like the splash page, like Cotopaxi. And I was like, what is this, And I wanted to know more. It's an idea. And so
their whole thing is gear for good. Is that
gear for good? That's their slogan. And
what does that mean?
It really kind of embodies this bigger idea of giving back to the world. So Cotopaxi is a B Corporation, and they're all about kind of like this social enterprise model. And so a lot of ways that they kind of demonstrate that is either through the production process, they use kind of materials that have been waste and turn them into product. They give creative control to a lot of the factory workers who are creating these different one-of-a-kind bags that are part of the Del Dia line. And then another component of that is that they donate 2% of their revenue into kind of this fund. And then from that, they have a cause marketing director who kind of goes through and vets out these specific organizations that are having an impact, and then they further enable those organizations to have an impact through a grantee fund. And so
take that 1% for the planet.
Exactly. So
Double
they're giving
that.
two. They're giving two.
Well, I got to ask you, Corey and I were talking earlier. Corey, thanks for setting up this audio equipment, by the way. A recent Facebook post from Chris Brinlee, just kind of the life of an ambassador out there, and we'll get to some other things that you do to make money, but you went ski touring, ripped groomers, sport climbing, soloed a boulder, the second flight iron here in Boulder, and ice climbed a waterfall all in one day.
All in 1 week, actually.
Oh,
so
I was
not.
like,
that was only in a week?
Which that's kind of for me like.
Oh, that's just like a normal week in Boulder.
Exactly. And that was kind of like the point I was trying to make there. Like having come from LA, like most of the time I'd be kind of on the road. And if I was in LA, it would be just enough to like repack and go somewhere else to be able to do those types of things. So I haven't been in a place in my entire life where I've been able to have that much amazing access to so many different amazing activities, all in such a close proximity. And so in the past, I would have had to either fly somewhere or drive for 5 hours to get to do those types of things. But the fact that I can do them all 30 minutes from my house now is pretty incredible.
I was checking out your website, Chris, like I told you earlier before we started recording, and everyone has to check out his website because you really get lost in it. It's really amazing.
Awesome photography.
Awesome
really
photography, great storyteller, and
the site's slick, too. You said for Squarespace?
Yeah, it's powered by Squarespace.
And he designed the whole thing himself, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So one thing that really pulled me in is your first line at the top of your website. You're a celebrator of discomfort. I love that. That's awesome. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means to you?
It's kind of, I think in a lot of ways, a core theme of every adventure. And if you really distill adventure down, what that is any experience that pushes you outside of your comfort zone. And the outdoors, in many ways, facilitates that better than anything because you're facing off against yourself, you're facing off against the elements. It's these very dynamic environments, and you're kind of in a lot of ways responsible for the decisions that can lead to discovering the unknown and to pushing past the envelope of this known realm. And for me, getting into this stuff kind of from a very fresh perspective and very new, it was something that resonated with me really hard. I wanted from the beginning to push harder and to like be stronger and to go farther and deeper and to more remote places. And as I've kind of grown as an outdoor adventurer and kind of an aspiring alpinist, these experiences have been very definitive of my life, and they've shaped the way that I think. And they're, in a lot of ways, inspiring for me personally. And I want to share that inspiration with other people, because everybody can experience discomfort and they can grow from that experience. And so I really want to push people to go out and experience discomfort in whatever way is possible or new for them. And as they continue to have those experiences, that envelope will continue to grow, and they'll have just a better perspective on life and the world and themselves.
Hey, it's Corey. What's a good example of your first experience of going through that?
Not necessarily my first experience, but a recent one. My climbing partner and I, Christian Landley, were in the European Alps, and we were there kind of pretty late season for climbing. It was on into October, and we had this idea. Both of us had kind of always wanted to climb the Eiger. And so we're like, okay, let's go climb the Eiger. And we kind of looked into the beta and chose the route, which the one we ended up deciding on was the Mitigeli route, which kind of was notable because it was winter. There had been snow coming in, and so the route was kind of out of condition for the normal season, but that route doesn't really have a lot of objective hazards. And so we felt that that would be kind of like the best option for us to take given the late season conditions. And so we kind of went and we're doing our research and getting all the beta we needed, and we were lucky enough to find a weather window that was really ideal. There were 2 days in between a bunch of days of snow and clouds and ice and general conditions that you wouldn't really want to be up on a 13,000 foot peak in. And so we go up there, and just to get to the Mitigeli hut is kind of an adventure in itself. You take a train up from Interlaken, which is this cool village in this valley in Switzerland, and you take this train up, and the train goes into a tunnel, and it stops in the middle of this tunnel. And then there's these big panorama windows that look out over these glaciers. And the train conductor will come around, and she noticed that we had helmets and climbing gear, and she's like, "Where are you getting off?" And we're like, "We're getting off at the Eismeer." And so we get off at the stop, and she escorts us to the back of this kind of little enclave in this tunnel. And she points at a steel door, and she's like, "How many of there are you?" And we're like, "There's 2 of us." She's like, "Okay, don't make us come rescue you." Because once you get off and walk through that steel tunnel, you go down through this cave in the middle of the mountain, and you come to an old rickety wooden doorway. And once you get to that doorway, you have to set up a rappel on this sketchy ass like metal frame, and you rappel down on the glacier. And once you're onto the glacier, there's really no turning back from this route. Even though you haven't even gotten to the route, at this point, you're fully committed because you can't really get back down to the valley. And this rock is just so crumbly and steep that you can't climb back up either. There's no way to protect it. And so we rappel down, and we like kind of do the approach on this glacier, and we get onto like kind of the approach to the hut. It has its own like 5th class, like low 5th class slabby, crumbly climbing essentially just to get to the hut. So we get up to the hut, and it's almost sunset on this first day, and we're looking up at the route. And we look up at the route, and it is a lot more intimidating than either of us had ever imagined. But at this point, we can't go back down.
Doesn't look scary in the pictures.
Exactly. And so this route kind of goes at, I think, around like 5'8" rock, but then there was a lot of ice on the route and some really steep snow. And it was just like really bigger than anything that either of us had tackled in kind of a mixed alpine climbing realm. But, you know, we're up here, and it's like, okay, well, this is a beautiful sunset, beautiful valley, and a beautiful peak, but we can't not go up. Basically, the only way we can get down is to go over the summit and down on the other side. So we get our alpine start, and we're like kind of up on the route by around 4 a.m., and we're cruising pretty good. We're making good progress. And as the morning progresses, we see this other party kind of coming up behind us, and they're moving really quickly. And what we realized was that the day before, they'd gone up and kind of scouted like the first several sections of the route and then gone back down to the hut. And so they were kind of like retracing their steps through a section that they already knew. So they caught up to us really quickly. And so we're kind of at a good belay station, and it's like, okay, we had 45 minutes on them, but they caught up to us, so we should probably let them pass. So we let them pass, but that turned out to be the biggest mistake ever, because as soon as they passed us, they just turned it down from like 10 to 2 and just slowed down. And because this route is so narrow and it's just like so precarious, there was really no opportunities for us to pass them again. And we were just stuck behind them every single pitch. And we got up to this section, and it's starting to get dark, and we weren't anywhere near the summit. We probably still had several hundred vertical feet to go. Summit Post said it was supposed to take up to about 8 hours ascent. We got up to about 14 hours, and we still weren't at the summit. And we see them setting up a bivy site with their big, massive winter sleeping bags and their bivy sacks and all of this. And we're like, well, shit, we don't have bivy sacks. We don't have a tent. We barely have a sleeping bag. I had this 32-degree Mountain Hardwear Mountain Speed, kind of like this lightweight, weighs a pound, almost sort of an emergency bag, broken zipper. And we're like, okay, so in our mind, this is like what we have to kind of deal with. And so I am thinking, if we can just make it to the summit, we can at least see the descent and figure out where the hut is that we're trying to get to on the other side. But I knew that if we didn't get up to the summit before dark, we wouldn't have kind of that visual reference. And so the clock was really ticking. And so at this point, like, Christian is kind of like getting very dark. We still don't have our headlamps out because we're just trying to motor through. And Christian has me lead like this next pitch. And it's probably a good 100 feet run out with like no placements, just like this straight drop on the north side of the Eiger on one side, and this like crumbly, just disastrous looking south face. And it's dark and I can't see anything. I can't place anything. And I'm just soloing up this thing, basically, simul-soloing. And
I hope your mom's not listening.
Yeah, I don't think she knows all of these details of this story. But this whole time I'm going up this thing, I'm just thinking, like, if I fall right now, we're both going to die. And so I'm just like in my head, all right, you can't fall. You got to keep going. So I get up to this place where I can put like a nice kind of terrain anchor around a big boulder, and I belay Christian up to the place, and we're just looking around, and there's just like nowhere we can stop. We can't keep going, and there's nowhere really to sleep either. And I spot this gully about 120 feet down from us, and it's just like this crumbly south face, just this disgusting rock, just trossy limestone. It's just like Christian described it as a nature valley bar. You know how when you open one of those, how they crumble? That was the rock that we were climbing. And so down below, I see a pile of these nature valley crumbs, and it looks somewhat flat from up above. And so I'm like, all right, here's the deal. This is what we need to do. We're going to like wrap down. We're essentially going to fix our rope, wrap down this thing. And we only had a 60-meter rope, but this thing was probably more than half our rope length. And so I was like, we can just leave one end attached. We'll wrap down. We'll try and bivvy down there. And then the next morning we can jug up with our prussics up to the anchor and keep going. So we kind of both decided that would be the best course of action. So we get down there, and this place is maybe like the little edge.
Up a rope with a prusik is so much fun.
So much fun. But I figured it would be a lot more fun than option one, which was to stay there standing up all night. And so we get down and we find like this crumbly, not very flat pile of rocks, and it was definitely not as flat as I was hoping from above, but we're able to kind of kick it out and make a little platform where we can kind of have this shiver bivvy, and we like both get inside this little tiny Mountain Hardwear sleeping bag that's barely big enough for me, and I'm not a big guy. We only have one sleeping bag. It's like definitely around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're just like, do you guys remember that movie Without a Paddle? Did you guys ever see that? They're like, there's this scene and they're like underneath this cave, they don't have any clothes and they're just freezing their asses off, and the song comes on and they're like, my mind's saying no, but my body's saying let's go. That was basically Christian and I on the south face of the Eiger, just cuddling, spooning with each other through the night, teeth chattering, like hyperventilating from the cold. And it was the coldest night I've ever had. And it was also the most beautiful sunrise I've ever had, because not only did the sunrise deliver life-giving warmth.
Yeah, your
Those
first love
loving
moment
eyes.
with the dude.
Exactly. And
Romance.
the sun came up and we survived, and we jugged back up this rope and finished climbing the route to the summit and celebrated, and then got the fuck down and made our way to the next hut where we'd stay that night. But it was just like this moment where a lot of things could have gone pretty wrong. And if they had, we probably would have been majorly screwed, but we kind of made it out okay. And it was just like a good learning lesson. Don't be slow was kind of the moral of the story, and don't let anybody pass you.
Yeah.
That was,
Where did you learn these technical rock climbing skills, like anchor building, and you mentioned Prusik, that's like attaching a rope to a rope so you can get up it. And
yeah. So the first kind of introduction to mountaineering for me was with winter mountaineering and the Sierra course with American Alpine Institute. And so we went and basically learned how to do snow climbing and mountaineering on Mount Whitney. And so that was the first mountain that I climbed after having seen that Mount Hoffman off in the distance. And so I kind of like did that. I went and climbed another 6,000 meter, or my first 6,000 meter peak in Nepal, just kind of on a guided trip, but wanted to test myself at altitude, and just kind of continued.
how did that go?
I suffered a little bit from the altitude, but I think it was mostly due to having had sun poisoning like the day before I went up and climbed, and was just like puking my guts out and had no energy. Then I went and climbed.
If it's not the altitude, it's the sun that'll
It
get
was
ya.
the sun. I fell asleep on the porch. It was
Nepal's
like nice
no joke,
outside.
bro.
Yeah, no joke. But the second one I went and did was much better. We just flew up that. But so kind of after those experiences, I went and took AMTL, which is Alpine Mountaineering Technical Leadership. Took another course with American Alpine Institute, and so that was kind of where I got into trad climbing. I learned to follow trad, learn crevasse rescue, and some of these other skills that
So
are
you're not
necessary
just
for that.
you don't just set off for these kind of adventures willy nilly. There was some preparation.
Yeah,
and
definitely
some-
a lot of training and preparation to kind of get up to this level. Like I said, I am pretty new at this, but I realized how important the proper training would be, and I wanted to learn legit. So all the guides are AMGA certified and just really super dialed. And I wanted to be able to kind of make sure that the knowledge I was getting was going to be reputable and kind of be able to save my life in scenarios, or perhaps not be in scenarios where my life needs saving by taking these types of courses.
You did all that training in a short amount of time.
Yeah, it's been pretty accelerated.
He's
a year.
efficient.
Or how you did all that training in
He wanted to get out of that rat race, man.
Yeah.
He's motivated.
I was
He's a fast learner.
I was about 26 when I climbed Mount Whitney and took that first course, and I'm 28 now. So since then, I've kind of
And how many countries have you been to in that span?
maybe around 18 or so.
Awesome.
6 continents.
From 0 countries to 18.
Yeah, something like
Well
that.
done, sir.
The only continent I haven't been on yet is South America, so I'm hoping to maybe go do a climbing trip down there this winter, perhaps.
And you must know our friend Aaron Outdoors, Aaron Sullivan. Then.
Yeah.
Is this a small community of outdoor adventurers? Who
It definitely is. We've had the chance to connect through different mutual friends and stuff in industry-related events and whatnot.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're a cotopaxi ambassador, but that's not all of your income. That's part of your income. What else do you do to make this work?
Yeah, so in addition to kind of the branded content creation with brands like Cotopaxi and GoPro and LifeStraw, I also do a decent amount of editorial work with different kind of magazine outlets, most notably Indefinitely Wild, which is kind of a subside of Outside Online magazine.
And what is Inkwell? What's your relationship with them?
Inkwell Network is based here in Boulder, and so they're kind of like a artist management and representation company, and so they do a lot of social media management for different athletes, like guys from Jimmy Chin and Travis Rice, Chris Burkard, and Mike Horn, who I most recently kind of was on a big trip with. Mike Horn is this incredible polar explorer, just in a lot of ways, he's the last of his kind. This guy is currently skiing solo across the South Pole in Antarctica. And so I had the opportunity to go down on his sailing vessel, the Pangaea, and basically we dropped him off on the ice after this 2-week open ocean crossing. And then he started skiing across the continent all by himself, pulling this 500-pound sled loaded down with 85 days worth of food and supplies. So
He's like Eric Larson. That guy's just like likes the cold and likes to suffer. He explained like polar exploration. He's like, just sit in a tub with a white wall in front of your face, and that's what polar exploration is like.
and so
it's cold and it's boring.
Yeah, and
but good on that. So how did that come about? Through Inkwell?
Yeah, and kind of in a couple ways, it sort of did develop through Inkwell because Mike Horn is on their roster. But my kind of initial introduction to Inkwell was through Travel Alberta. I am an ambassador for GoPro, and I do a bunch of content creation for their blog called The Inside Line. And they had a GoPro athlete camp up in Alberta in Banff 2 autumns ago. And so I was up there for that. But at the same time, Travel Alberta was also doing this kind of photo shoot and content creation mission with Jimmy Chin. And so I had the opportunity to go helicamping with Jimmy and kind of this other team of kind of outdoor athletes that were pretty local to that area.
Wait, so you don't know anything about the outdoors 2 years ago, and in 2 years you've flown to 18 countries and had expeditions with like fun times with Jimmy Chin and what the hell? This is amazing, man. Well done. You're just a man that was on a mission that's making it happen, huh?
Yeah, that's what it comes down to.
So what's the next chapter for you?
The next chapter, this past year was really sporadic. Like there were a lot of times where I might be on a string of trips that would be a week of different trips that were like 5 in a row, like different climates, like different places. And that got really hectic as far as packing and logistics and planning and all of that stuff. And it was just pretty overwhelming. And those were kind of peppered with larger, longer trips, kind of like this Mike Horn Pole to Pole expedition or my expedition to Eastern Greenland or the Alps trip with Christian. And so this year I'm kind of shifting things around a bit and I'm trying to do less of these like little back and forth trips.
Wait, are you trying to get more corporate?
I'm not trying to get more
He's trying
corporate.
to go back corporate, isn't he, Corey?
That's not the case, but I do want to spend more time here in the Front Range in Colorado. Just it's an amazing training grounds, and the access that it provides is incredible. And so I know that that'll be pretty crucial into helping me continue to develop as an athlete, because ultimately a lot of the objectives that I have are bigger and farther and more remote. So I want to do some stuff in the Alaska range later in this year, maybe China or Asia, kind of in the northern Himalaya. So those are kind of like some of the objectives that I have. And so by splitting my time more between here and those longer objectives, I'll be able to be a little more focused. And that focus ultimately, I think, will be good.
And you're also launching a company?
I'm also launching a company
this
year. Yeah, so Christian and I actually met through mutual friends on social media and Instagram, and we had never met in person until we met in Chamonix for this trip that we had simultaneously planned together. And so
that is 21st century mountaineering right there, ladies and gentlemen.
So
Wade Morris and Jason Anton are out there just shaking their head like, no.
The day after we met, we found ourselves on the south face of the Aiguille de Midi on the Rebufat route, which was beyond anything I had ever climbed, and I French freed the entire thing, just kind of pulling on gear to get up. But Christian just like brilliantly led every single pitch of what was, for me, the scariest alpine rock climbing of my life. And we got up to the top and kind of missed the last lift station, like the last tram down, and ended up sleeping on the bathroom floor of the Aiguille de Midi, which I guess is kind of like a coming of age type thing, but we did it on our first day there. So we kind of inducted ourselves into the Chamonix community pretty quickly that way. But kind of from that point on, Christian and I just hit it off really hard and had this amazing dynamic, not just for climbing, but also with content creation. We both had really similar goals and similar mindsets, and it was just this very dynamic relationship that translated really well to the things we were passionate about. And so for the last few years, like before I quit my job, I had kind of attempted to work with a couple other partners to launch a kind of creative agency that focused on adventure travel stories in the outdoors. But none of us really had kind of the reputation or the resources to pull that off. And so kind of fast forward a few years, and I've been working really hard to kind of develop those different angles. I felt like the time was nigh to launch that. And so we just actually signed, kind of filled out our paperwork and submitted everything and got legit here in the state of Colorado. So we are now Content Machine LLC.
Content Machine LLC. Watch out, people. The content's coming your way.
Yeah, and so essentially what Content Machine is, it kind of pulls in branding and creative strategy and social strategy, kind of these things that were very integral into my previous career as an art director with this new career as content creators, doing photography and video and these different more production related projects. And so Content Machine is kind of the marriage of both of those things. And it's going to allow us to focus on bigger ideas that wouldn't necessarily just be confined to, say, a social media influencer.
And you do a beautiful job. You've done a beautiful job doing that type of thing with your own life. Like when I was reading through your stuff, it was as if you were art directing your own life and sharing it, and it worked. It was magic. You do a great job doing that. I think it's perfect.
What's the rub on that kind of thing, though? Because that's another topic that kind of comes up on this podcast a lot is, you know, when your job is to like make everything look exciting and you can do this and everything's epic and every sunset is awesome. And, you know, there's a bit of a rub there because it's not always awesome. Like the story you were just telling. I mean, none of that was awesome. And I would be curious how you maybe portrayed even that trip on social media.
And that's kind of what is really unique to the way I like to present myself, because it's not always awesome. A lot of times it sucks, and I'm not afraid to put that out there. I try and be really real with my stories, and it's like maybe it is a picture of a beautiful sunrise, but it's a sunrise that occurred after suffering out of my mind, and the words or the copy or the captions, they reflect that. And so that's something, to me, it's really important to be real. And it's like not easy. And there are a lot of struggles that kind of come with this type of work and lifestyle. And I do my best to put that foot forward and to like really bring people in to where they can understand kind of what goes on behind these more kind of polished images. And there's a lot of people out there who are creating these amazing, beautiful images of these inspiring landscapes. And that's really amazing to look at. And for me, I take joy in kind of seeing those beautiful images because they're just very aesthetic. But I don't really consider myself that great of a photographer. I kind of just see myself going out to these places and portraying them how I see them. And it's not always beautiful and it's not always sunshine and rainbows. A lot of times it's really gnarly and it just kind of sucks.
You write in your stories about how there's so much discomfort, and then you describe the photograph as here's what came after the discomfort. And when you talk about joy, it's like you really have to experience a lot of discomfort to experience just the joy that you're feeling after that.
Yeah, I think so. Like there's one thing to be said about like driving up to some of these places and parking on the side of the highway and taking a photo. That's not what I'm about, and that's not what I do. And that's okay that some people do that, but for me, I want a greater depth of experience, and I want my life to be shaped by that greater depth of experience. And so I'm constantly pushing myself out as far as I can go, and I align myself with people who are also going to do the same.
Well, how do we find you, Chris? If people are excited about what they're hearing, how do they find your work and follow along with you?
Yeah, so kind of my most frequently posted platform is Instagram. Chris Brinlee Jr. is my social media handle for all different media. My website, chrisbrinleejr.com, is a home to a lot of different gear reviews I've done for editorial outlets and kind of like trip report, more adventure inspiring type pieces, as well as like different features. And then my photography and everything else is kind of on there too. So it's sort of like a hub, but if you want to see what's going on with the day-to-day, definitely check out Instagram and the Instagram stories that I post.
And what are there any athletes that you follow that inspire you, folks in the Boulder area or whatnot that you follow personally?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of the bigger names that a lot of people are probably familiar with are like Jimmy Chin and Corey Richards. As athletes, those guys are absolutely impeccable, and what they accomplish in the Alpine is just like mind-blowing, especially as an aspiring alpinist. And that's definitely something that I really look up to. And then in addition to that, they're such incredible storytellers. And so to kind of like really have that whole package, that's really amazing.
Right on. And what in the front range is on your tick list as far as things you want to get done? We saw you solo the second. Is it the second flat iron?
Yeah,
you
the
did?
second flat iron.
Yeah, you did some ice climbing, and where were you doing that?
Done a couple days this week out at Hidden Falls, which
Yeah.
is kind of in Wild Basin area of Rocky Mountain.
Yeah.
Definitely want to get out and kind of tackle some of Rocky Mountain's alpine objectives.
The Mummy Range. Maybe he should come with us on the Mummy Range.
I'm down.
All right.
That's the thing about me. If you ask me, chances are I'm going to say yes.
Yeah,
I'm
right
going to
on.
be there.
All right,
So
cool.
that's a ticket right there.
And last question, since you're in this world, I mean, this is the outdoor adventure space that you're in. Who else should we be having on the show?
My friend Katie Bouet, who is this really inspiring person. She actually just joined Cotopaxi's ambassador team. Has this really strong voice in the outdoor industry for advocacy, protecting lands, and different topics like that, which are really important. And just like super cool person to hang out with. Andy Cochran is another guy you guys should check out. He's the marketing director for Oro Kayak. His parents were national park superintendents, so he just kind of like bounced around different parks growing up, but he's just like always getting after it. Super rad dude.
Cool.
Got some cool adventures planned with him for this year too.
Yeah, awesome. Kelly?
It was really nice meeting you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're so inspiring. Thanks so much for coming,
My
especially
pleasure.
to my house.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Yeah,
Thanks for
anytime.
the cheese and salami spread. All right, till next time, guys. www.dispatchradio.com.